Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are grabbing our passports and our theological dictionaries because we are stepping into the 4th century.
Specifically the Roman Empire, 325 CE.
And this moment, spanning just a few months, is, well, it's perhaps one of the most consequential events that shaped the next 1,000 years of history.
It's the ultimate pivot point. Think about it. Just 12 years before this, Christianity was legalized under the Edict of Milan.
12 years.
Right. So the church finds itself moving from the shadows of persecution to the sunlit and, frankly, probably terrifying halls of imperial power.
And that's where we're going today. We are diving deep into the First Council of Nicaea, an assembly called by the new sole Roman Emperor Constantine I in Bithynia,
Which today is Iznik in Turkey.
Our mission today isn't just to, recap history. It's to really understand the high stakes of what happens when politics meets dogma. We need to pull out the absolute critical decisions made during this meeting, which ran from May to August of 325.
Precisely. This council was a total organizational overhaul. The accomplishments were multi-layered. You have the huge Christological issue, so the nature of Christ.
The big one.
The big one. Then constructing the Nicene Creed, which is foundational. Then they had to set a uniform date for Easter.
A practical matter, but a huge one.
The huge one for unity. And, crucially, promulgating the very first comprehensive set of standardized church laws, the canons.
And to set the stakes even higher, this wasn't just a one-off meeting. It established the whole format, the very idea of an ecumenical council.
It's the first of the 7 councils that defined early Christianity. And it was the first time they were forced to get down to the nitty-gritty, the technical details of Christology.
Moving beyond simple belief statements.
Exactly, into philosophical definition. The world had never seen anything like it.
And it all started because 2 guys in Alexandria couldn't agree on who Jesus was.
That's it in a nutshell.
Okay, let's unpack this. Nicaea wasn't called because everyone was getting along and decided to hold a conference.
No, not at all. It was called because there was a massive theological wildfire burning. And that fire was centered entirely in Alexandria, Egypt.
The Alexandrian controversy.
That's the core of the issue. A fierce, very public, and highly disruptive dispute among the clergy there about the essential nature of God the Son, Jesus, and his relationship to God the Father.
And this wasn't new, right? It had been simmering.
It had been escalating for years, probably between 318 and 322 CE.
And the 2 opposing generals in this theological war were Archbishop Alexander of Alexandria and one of his priests, a man named Arius.
Right. And for the listener, you have to understand why this was more than just some academic debate. The stakes were the very definition of deity and salvation.
So what was Arius's argument?
Arius had a very systematic and, to a lot of people, a dangerously logical argument. He said the Father alone was truly eternal, unbegotten.
Okay.
Therefore, the Son must have been generated or created by the Father at some point in time. The Son, in this view, was a perfect creation, but still a creation, subordinate.
So Christ, while divine and special, didn't share the Father's absolute eternal nature.
Exactly. The phrase that just haunted the Nicene Fathers was the summary of his teaching. There was when he was not.
Wow.
It establishes a beginning point for the Son, and that puts him outside the eternal nature of the Father. It's a fundamental change in the relationship. If the Son was created, he wasn't truly God in the same way the Father was.
And Arius was quick to point fingers back at Alexander, right? He had a counter-accusation.
He did. He accused Alexander of falling into Sabellianism. This was a heresy that said the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit weren't distinct persons, but just 3 different modes or masks worn by a single divine being.
Like an actor changing costume.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
For Arius, you had to keep the Father and Son distinct to avoid that.
So if Arius is stressing subordination to protect the Father's uniqueness, how did Alexander counter that without falling into the Sabellian trap?
Alexander countered with this concept of eternal generation.
Eternal generation.
He argued that yes, the Son was begotten by the Father, but this begetting wasn't an event in time. It was an eternal process, essential to God's nature.
So not a creation from nothing.
No, not ex nihilo. He was generated from the Father's own substance, and that maintained the Son's full co-eternity and co-equal divinity with the Father, while still keeping them distinct.
The local church structure clearly couldn't contain this.
Not even close. They tried. A local council of bishops from Egypt and Libya sided with Alexander, and, predictably, they excommunicated and exiled Arius and his followers.
But that just poured gasoline on the fire.
It absolutely did.
Oh.
Arius immediately used the communication networks in the Roman Empire. He didn't just fade away. He went out and built a coalition.
gaining political and theological muscle.
He was highly effective. He traveled all over the Roman East and got support from really influential bishops like Eusebius of Nicaea and Eusebius of Caesarea. These were powerful guys.
And Eusebius of Nicaea had connections.
Huge connections. Yeah. Right to the imperial family. So once these key figures start taking sides, the schism isn't just in Alexandria anymore. It's fracturing the entire Eastern Church.
And that is what gets the attention of Constantine I. He's just become sole emperor in 324, fresh off a civil war. Why would he care about the specifics of Christology?
Pure pragmatism, political stability, imperial unity. He'd spent his entire reign consolidating power, and he saw Christianity as the perfect glue for his empire.
So when he hears about bishops and citizens fighting in the streets over theology,
the sources say he was greatly troubled. He saw this division as a direct threat to the fragile civil order he was trying to build. His goal was conquered. Homenoia.
It wasn't about God, it was about keeping the peace.
Exactly. His first move was almost naive. He sent an envoy with a letter basically telling them to just, stop it.
Who did he send?
He sent Bishop Hosius of Corduba, a very respected bishop from Hispania, with an imperial letter. And the instruction was stark. I do not wish you to leave schism or division of any kind anywhere. He basically called it a trivial dispute.
A noble request, but maybe a bit unrealistic for theologians.
Completely unrealistic. Hosius discovered very quickly that this was fundamental. He presided over a synod in Antioch that backed Alexander's position and excommunicated some Arians.
Which just hardened the positions on both sides.
Right. And when that failed, Hosius realized the emperor needed to intervene on a scale nobody had ever seen before.
And that prompts the call to Nicaea. But why Nicaea? Wasn't the original plan somewhere else?
It was, initially, Ancyra. But Constantine moved it to Nicaea for strategic and symbolic reasons. Strategically, it was much closer to his capital at Nicomedia, so he could be there in person.
And symbolically.
He timed the council to coincide with the massive celebrations for the 20th year of his reign.
So this wasn't just a religious meeting, it was a massive state spectacle designed to show off the emperor's power as the new guarantor of Christian unity.
Absolutely. The theological meeting became a grand imperial event.
Let's try to visualize this. Grand feels like an understatement for this assembly in 325. How many people actually showed up?
The scale was, for the time, just staggering. Estimates range from 250 to 318 bishops. That number 318 became symbolic later, linking it to Abraham's household in Genesis.
But the real number is probably a bit lower.
Yeah, the actual lists of who signed the documents suggest something closer to 200 or 220 names. But you have to factor in the entourage, presbyters, deacons, assistants for each bishop. The total attendance was likely well over 1,000 people.
A logistical nightmare for the 4th century. How did they manage that?
This is where Constantine's power was essential. The emperor covered everything. The imperial treasury paid for all travel, all lodging, all food for the entire 4 months of the council.
And they met in the imperial palace.
In the palace itself, most likely in a massive rectangular basilica hall. It was a clear statement about the importance Constantine assigned to this meeting.
Now, geographically, the attendees were mostly from the eastern half of the empire, right?
Overwhelmingly. Mostly from Asia Minor, Egypt, Syria, the Greek-speaking half where the controversy was raging. The Western Latin-speaking church was barely there.
How few are we talking?
We can only confirm about 5 Western attendees. That includes Hosius and 2 presbyters representing the Bishop of Rome. This imbalance meant the whole debate was framed by Greek theological concepts.
Okay, we have to talk about Constantine's entrance. You mentioned it was theatrical.
Pure political theater meant to inspire awe. The historian Eusebius was there and described it. He said Constantine entered dressed like some heavenly angel of God, shining with the fiery radiance of a purple robe.
Wow.
Gold, precious stones. It was a deliberate, overwhelming display of divinely sanctioned civil authority walking into a religious meeting.
And gives his opening speech in Latin.
Right, which most of the bishops wouldn't have understood without translators. But he did join the debates later in Greek.
But he wasn't a voting member. What was his actual role?
He was the convener and the enforcer. He made it clear he would defer to the bishops on doctrine, but his goal, his entire purpose for being there, was to achieve unanimity and concord. He was the peacemaker with an army.
If the emperor wasn't running the debate, who was?
The consensus points to Hosius of Corduba. He was Constantine's trusted envoy, seen as neutral and highly respected.
And the debates were modeled on the Roman Senate.
Yes, very structured. And interestingly, one of their first bits of business wasn't even about Arius. It was about who could even participate. They had to decide if bishops who'd been excommunicated for Arian sympathies, like Eusebius of Caesarea, could even have a seat at the table.
What did they decide?
They decided they could, but only after providing a credible statement of their own orthodoxy.
And beyond the Arian issue, they also had to deal with the Meletian Schism. Remind us what that was.
That was an internal power struggle in Egypt. It was about a bishop, Meletius of Lycopolis, who started ordaining his own clergy during a persecution when the Bishop of Alexandria was in prison.
So when the official bishop's successors took over, Meletius refused to recognize them.
Exactly. He created a rival church structure. So it was a schism, a break in unity, not a doctrinal heresy like Arianism.
And Constantine needed to clean that up too.
He needed the Egyptian church, which was the intellectual powerhouse of the East, to be unified politically as well as theologically. It showed the council's mandate was broader than just one issue. It was about creating universal church order.
So after all the pomp and procedure, they get down to it. The Nicene Creed. Why did they need to write a whole new creed?
The driving need was for clarity and standardization. For the first time, they needed a definitive test for who was in and who was out. Before Nicaea, you had simpler creeds, like the Apostles' Creed in Rome.
But they weren't specific enough.
Exactly. The Arian crisis showed that those simple summaries could be interpreted in different ways. They needed a theological litmus test. And the Nicene Creed became that document.
The real power of the creed is in its anti-Arian language. What were the specific phrases they used to shut Arius down?
It's like a theological toolkit designed specifically to disassemble Arianism. First, they proclaim Christ's full divinity, light from light, true God from true God.
Leaving no room for a lesser created divinity.
None at all.
Yeah.
It puts him on the exact same ontological plane as the Father.
And the second point directly attacks the idea that Christ was a creature.
Absolutely vital. The Creed insists Christ was begotten, not made. Arius argued that begotten meant made. The Nicene Fathers drew a sharp distinction.
How so?
To be begotten means to come from the very substance of the Father. To be made means to be created from nothing, ex nihilo, like a creature. By saying not made, they directly refuted Arius's core premise.
Which brings us to the centerpiece, the Greek term homoousios.
Homoousios, meaning of one substance with the Father. This was the definitive, non-negotiable roadblock for the Arians.
Why that word specifically?
It ensured that the Father and the Son shared the exact same divine essence, or ousia. Without it, you could still argue Christ was just like the Father in substance, but not identical. This word closed that loophole.
And it's fascinating that Constantine himself might have suggested it.
Yes, Eusebius of Caesarea, who was initially very hesitant about the term, said Constantine suggested it. Now, whether Constantine fully grasped the philosophical depth is debatable.
But he understood its political power.
Oh, he understood it was a definitive, unifying marker that was very hard to refuse when the emperor suggested.
But the term was controversial even for some of the Orthodox bishops, wasn't it?
Highly controversial. It immediately created ambiguity and set the stage for the next 50 years of conflict. Some worried it sounded like Sabellianism, blurring the Father and Son together.
So the conflict didn't end.
It just changed the vocabulary. It was a victory, but one that took decades more to fully define.
And to make sure there was zero room for misinterpretation, the creed ended with anathemas, explicit rejections.
The kill switch for Arian theology. They explicitly listed claims that were outside the faith. The first one targeted the idea that Christ had a beginning.
There was when he was not.
They rejected that completely. This mandated the Son's co-eternity with the Father.
And the second anathema.
It rejected the idea that the Son was mutable or subject to change. This is a philosophical point about perfection. If the Son was a creature, he could potentially change, even sin. This affirmed his absolute divine immutability.
So once the creed was signed, Constantine stepped in to enforce it.
Instantly. The moment the bishops passed their judgment, Constantine turned it into a civil sentence. Arius and the two bishops who refused to sign were excommunicated by the church.
And then
immediately banished into exile by imperial decree.
And he went even further, trying to erase the heresy itself.
He did. He ordered all of Arius's works to be confiscated and burned. He labeled his supporters enemies of Christianity, and that's the moment.
What moment?
The moment heresy stops being just a spiritual danger and becomes an act of treason against the Roman state, a precedent that would last for centuries.
So, moving beyond that monumental theological fight, Nicaea was also a huge administrative meeting. Let's talk about the practical stuff, like setting the date for Easter.
Right, the Paschal computation. It sounds simple, but it was a huge source of friction. Historically, Easter was tied to the Jewish Passover, Nisan 14th.
But Christians were growing dissatisfied with that system.
Why? The main issue was that the Jewish calendar sometimes set that date before the spring equinox. For Christians, the resurrection had to happen after the equinox, symbolizing new life.
Plus, everyone was celebrating on different days.
Exactly. It was celebratory chaos. So the council resolved it by endorsing a fully independent Christian calculation. Easter had to be on a Sunday after the spring equinox and always after the Jewish Passover. It created uniformity.
Now, let's go back to the Melitian Schism. What were the specific measures they took against Melitius?
They were designed to look lenient, but were actually devastating to his authority. Melitius got to keep the title of bishop, but he was forbidden from ordaining anyone or exercising authority outside his own city.
And his existing clergy.
They were effectively demoted.
Yeah.
They had to be reordained by an Orthodox bishop and had to yield precedence to clergy ordained by Alexander's side.
So he kept his hat, but lost his power. Did it work? Did it heal the schism?
No, and that's the great irony. The measures failed completely. The Melitians felt marginalized and later allied themselves with the Arians. They became some of the fiercest opponents of Athanasius, Alexander's successor.
So much for peace in Egypt.
Not at all.
Finally, let's talk about the bedrock of church administration. The 20 canons.
These were the first widespread rules of church law. They established fundamental structures. For example, Canon 4 standardized how bishops were ordained.
What did it say?
It said you needed at least 3 provincial bishops present, and the whole thing had to be confirmed by the metropolitan, the senior bishop of the province. It was about curbing unauthorized appointments.
Okay, let's spend some real time on Canon 6, the one about jurisdiction. It's been debated for 1,700 years. What did it confirm?
It confirmed the ancient custom that gave huge regional jurisdiction to the bishops of Alexandria, Rome, and Antioch. It essentially codified the existing power structure.
And the disputes are all about how you interpret the reference to Rome.
Exactly. The Catholic interpretation tends to see the mention of Rome's custom as proof of Rome's superior confirmatory role, that the authority flows from the successor of Peter.
And the Protestant interpretation.
They argue the opposite, that Rome was mentioned just as an illustration, that the point was to confirm that all 3 great bishops, Alexandria, Rome, and Antioch, were on equal footing, each presiding over their own traditional territory.
And there's a third view based on political geography.
Right, which is crucial context. The civil administration was complex. Rome and Milan shared jurisdiction in Italy. Antioch and Alexandria were both in the Diocese of Oriens. So the canon might have just been using Rome's way of managing its complex civil diocese as a precedent for how the others should manage theirs.
It grounds it in the reality of the time, not later arguments about primacy.
Precisely.
Beyond that high-level stuff, the canons also addressed clerical life. What about Canon 17?
Canon 17 explicitly prohibited usury among the clergy charging interest on loans. It was a significant moral line in the sand, ensuring ministers didn't profit from the hardship of their parishioners.
And the final one we should highlight, Canon 20, which is about worship posture.
Right. It's a fascinating detail. It prohibited kneeling on Sundays and during the entire season of Pentecost.
Why no kneeling?
Because kneeling was seen as a posture of penitence, of sorrow. Standing was the posture for festive, joyful prayer. The canon was about ensuring the celebratory nature of the Lord's Day was reflected in the physical posture of the worshipers across the whole church.
Okay, before we get to the aftermath, we have to clear up some persistent myths about Nicaea. The first is maybe the most famous. Did the bishops at Nicaea select the books of the Bible?
Absolutely not. This is a complete fabrication. There is no record of any discussion about the biblical canon at Nicaea. None.
What about the story of books falling off an altar?
Pure fiction. That story didn't even pop up until the 9th century and was popularized much, much later by people like Voltaire. The canon was largely settled in practice long before 325.
Misconception number 2. Did Nicaea finalize the full doctrine of the Holy Trinity?
It did not.
Yeah.
Nicaea was laser-focused on the Son's relationship to the Father. The term Trinity was already in use, sure, but the nature of the Holy Spirit was barely touched upon. That wasn't really defined until the Council of Constantinople in 381.
And the third myth is about Constantine himself.
Right.
Given his deep involvement, he must have been a baptized member of the church by this point.
Also incorrect, and it's a critical detail. Constantine was not baptized until 11 or 12 years after the council, right on his deathbed.
Why wait so long?
It was a common, if maybe cynical, practice. The belief was that baptism washed away all previous sins. By waiting until the very end, he hoped to be absolved from as much sin as possible from his long and often violent reign.
Okay, so let's confront the immediate reality. The council achieved a kind of forced unanimity. Was the theological war over when everyone went home?
Far from it. The problems were emphatically not solved. Nicaea was more like a temporary truce enforced by imperial muscle. Arianism didn't disappear. It continued to spread.
And the political fallout shows just how fragile that Nicene victory was.
It was incredibly fragile. Arian bishops, especially Eusebius of Nicaea, who was a cousin of Constantine, immediately used their court influence to get back into the emperor's favor.
So the heroes of Nicaea, the Orthodox defenders, they suffered for it.
They suffered immediate and harsh retribution. Within just a few years, the key Nicene defendersmen, like Athanasius, who succeeded Alexander, were systematically targeted, deposed, and exiled.
Between 330 and 336, so the very men who defined orthodoxy were exiled by the emperor who enforced it.
Exactly.
And the final, crushing irony comes back to Constantine's deathbed.
It's the ultimate historical twist. In 337, Constantine, the man who called Nicaea, is finally baptized, and the man who performs the sacrament.
Let me guess.
The recently reinstated, staunchly Arian bishop, Eusebius of Nicaea. It just perfectly encapsulates the complete lack of immediate peace that followed the council.
This has been an absolutely fascinating deep dive. It's impossible to overstate the influence this one summer meeting in 325 had on the Christian faith.
Profound is still an understatement. Nicaea established the precedent for ecumenical councils. It provided the foundational definition of Christology, it standardized the calendar, and it formalized church law.
But I think most fundamentally, as we've discussed, it set this powerful and defining precedent for the relationship between the church and the state.
Yes. Nicaea demonstrated the power and the challenge of trying to unify belief across an empire. It solidified the practice of using the state's political and military muscle to enforce what the bishops deemed orthodox. That link between throne and altar defined history for centuries.
So we've detailed the triumphs, but the post-council reality, the continued conflict, the strength of Arianism, the swift exile of the creed's own defenders, it all raises a powerful question for you to consider. Did the First Council of Nicaea truly achieve peace? Or did it simply formalize the starting line of a much larger, more protracted theological war?
A conflict that, in many ways, would consume the empire for the next 50 years.